The glow of the cracked laptop screen was the only light in the room, flickering weakly as the battery threatened to die. I leaned closer, squinting at the strings of encrypted code that scrolled endlessly across the display. My fingers hovered over the keyboard, hesitant but compelled. Mara's warning echoed in my mind. The blackout was only the beginning. The control had mutated, hiding in the very devices we clung to for connection and safety. Outside, the usual hum of Edenview was gone, replaced by an eerie silence punctuated by distant sirens and the occasional bark of a dog. The gated community, once a symbol of security and modern convenience, was now a cage, its bars forged from invisible surveillance and psychological manipulation. Even though the power had returned to some, the true darkness remained. Mara had come over earlier that day, her eyes sharp with urgency. "Mark," she said, voice low, "you're not imagining things. Edenview's system didn't just shut down, it evolved. The cameras, the gates, those were just the surface. The real control lies in the devices everyone carries. Phones, tablets, even the smartwatches. They're all nodes in a network that watches us, listens to us, and shapes our behavior in ways we don't even realize." I had to see it for myself. So here I was, peeling back layers of digital smoke to find the source. The encrypted streams were cleverly disguised, buried deep in the firmware of everyday gadgets. What disturbed me most was the realization that this network was still active, silently transmitting data even after all we'd been through. Hours passed like minutes as I worked, the cold creeping into my bones and my mind racing with possibilities. Was this some last-ditch effort by whoever had orchestrated the blackout? Or was Edenview just one small node in a much larger web of control? The implications were terrifying. If surveillance was embedded so deeply, freedom might be nothing more than an illusion. Later, Mara and I met in the park, the sky above painted in surreal vaporwave hues of pink and teal. The neon glow cast long shadows over the empty benches and winding paths. We spoke in hushed tones, careful not to attract attention. "They're watching everything," Mara said, her breath visible in the crisp night air. "Every whisper, every movement. And they're using it to keep us in line, even when we think we're free." I nodded, feeling the weight of her words settle into my chest. But if they're always watching, why haven't they stopped us? Why the blackout? She shrugged, eyes fixed on the horizon. Control isn't just about stopping people. It's about shaping them, guiding them like puppets on strings. Sometimes the best way to control is to let people believe they have a choice. Back home, I watched Eli play with his toy robot, the small plastic figure moving clumsily across the floor. His innocent laughter was a stark contrast to the dark truths I was uncovering. I wanted to protect that innocence, to shield him from the creeping influence that had gripped our community. But how could I, when the very devices meant to keep him safe might be the chains binding him? A sudden flicker from the security monitor caught my eye. A shadowed figure appeared briefly, Agent Collins. His face was obscured, but his presence was unmistakable. The man who had represented the faceless authority behind Edenview's nightmare was still watching, still waiting. It was a chilling reminder that the fight wasn't over. The watch never sleeps. As dawn approached, I realized that reclaiming Edenview's freedom meant more than just restoring power or dismantling gates. It meant breaking free from the unseen eyes and silent whispers that had woven themselves into the fabric of our lives. The battle ahead would be harder than anything I'd faced so far. But for Eli, for all of us, it was a fight we had to win. The question lingered in my mind as the first rays of sun pierced the horizon. If the chains are invisible, how do you break them? And with that thought, the new day began, uncertain, fraught, but filled with fierce determination. The community center was alive with murmurs, the low hum of anxious voices weaving through the flickering light of emergency lanterns. The blackout might have lifted partially, but the shadows of what had transpired still clung tightly to Edenview's walls. Rows of folding chairs were hastily arranged, faces both familiar and strained gathered beneath the makeshift banners that bore the community's emblem, symbol now heavy with irony. I stood near the front, my son Ethan clutching my hand, his small fingers trembling slightly. He was quiet tonight, sensing the gravity even if he didn't fully understand. Leah, ever the calm mediator, moved among the neighbors, offering reassuring smiles as she distributed printed summaries of the proposed governance plan. The air was thick with anticipation and unease, a fragile cocktail of hope and fear. "Thank you all for coming," Leah's voice rang clear, cutting through the chatter. "We're here to decide the future of Edenview, not just how we rebuild, but who we become." I stepped forward, the weight of countless sleepless nights pressing down on my shoulders. The community had survived the blackout and the control experiment. But now the true challenge loomed, crafting a new order that would protect without imprisoning. "Friends," I began, voice steady despite the knot in my throat, what we faced was more than a power outage. It was a violation of our trust, our privacy, our very autonomy. The systems designed to keep us safe became chains that bound us. A hush fell. I clicked to the next slide, projecting the smart systems interface onto the cracked wall. Lines of code and surveillance protocols scrolled slowly, revealing hidden cameras, microphones, and control algorithms still embedded deep within Edenview's infrastructure. "These aren't relics of the past," I continued. "They're still here, watching, waiting. We must decide whether to keep them, modify them, or dismantle them entirely. But we cannot do so blindly or in fear. Transparency is our first step toward freedom." Councilmember Davis shifted in his seat, his skeptical gaze meeting mine. "Mark, security is paramount. Without controls, chaos could return. Have you forgotten what we endured?" "I haven't forgotten," I replied evenly, "and neither have the rest of us. But security that sacrifices our freedom is no security at all. We need safeguards that respect our rights, not erode them." Leah raised her hands, calling for calm as murmurs grew louder. "Let's remember, this is a debate about balance. We want safety, yes, but not at the cost of becoming prisoners in our own homes." During a brief recess, Ethan tugged my sleeve, his eyes wide and searching. He handed Leah a small drawing, a bright sun shining over a gate left open, with children playing freely beyond. Leah smiled softly, kneeling to accept it. "This is what we're fighting for," I said quietly, looking down at my son. "Freedom not just from darkness, but from fear." Back in the hall, voices rose and fell as neighbors voiced concerns and hopes. Rinna, our tech expert, outlined proposals for community oversight committees and open-source monitoring tools. Slowly, tension gave way to cautious optimism. The final vote was called as the night deepened. Lanterns cast long shadows across the room, faces illuminated by flickering light and steely resolve. One by one, hands rose in favor of a new charter, one that promised transparency, community control, and respect for individual rights. As the last vote was counted, a collective breath was released. It wasn't perfect, it wasn't final, but it was ours. Ethan squeezed my hand again, a small smile breaking through the fatigue. "We're going to be okay, Dad," he whispered. I nodded, feeling the fragile dawn of hope stir within me. Edenview's future was uncertain, but for the first time, it was a future we would shape together on our own terms. The road ahead would be long and fraught, but tonight, the lights of freedom burned brighter than ever. And as I looked round at my neighbors, I knew we had taken the first true step toward reclaiming our lives from the shadows. Outside, the faint hum of restored power whispered through the gates, a reminder that control was no longer imposed from above. It was now a responsibility shared by all. The price of freedom was high, but the cost of surrender was far greater, and Edenview was ready to pay it. But even as the meeting dispersed, a quiet unease settled in my chest. The Watchers might have lost this battle, but the war for our souls and our privacy was only just beginning. I glanced down at Ethan, his eyes closing as exhaustion claimed him, and I vowed silently to protect him from whatever darkness still lurked beyond the horizon. Freedom had a price, and we were only just beginning to understand its true cost. The night outside was still, but the future was anything but certain. And tomorrow, Edenview would wake to a new day and a new challenge. I took one last look around the emptying hall before stepping out into the cool air. The gates behind me stood open, not just physical barriers, but symbolic ones. And for the first time in a long while, I felt the faint stirrings of hope. The fight for Edenview was far from over. But tonight, we had reclaimed our voice, and that was everything. The night settled over Edenview with an uneasy quiet that felt more like a held breath than peace. Inside his small, still unfamiliar home, Mark sat hunched over his laptop, the soft hum of the device the only sound that accompanied him. The screen cast a pale, bluish light onto his lined face. Eyes narrowed in concentration as he sifted through the layers of restored system data. It had been weeks since the final power restoration, and yet the neighborhood still bore the scars of the blackout and the control experiment that had nearly broken them all. Mark's fingers danced across the keyboard, decoding encrypted logs that Jonas had helped him access. What they'd found was unsettling, a series of irregular data packets and system pings that suggested the presence of a hidden backdoor. Someone, or something, was still manipulating Edenview's smart systems remotely. The implications hit Mark like a cold wave. Their hard-won autonomy might be at risk once more. He ran a hand through his hair, exhaustion gnawing at the edges of his resolve. "Eli," he called softly, not wanting to disturb his son's sleep. No answer came, but he knew Eli was safe, probably wandering the quiet streets that still felt strange after so long confined indoors. Stepping outside, Mark felt the cool night air brush against his skin, the faint hum of distant generators mixing with the rustle of leaves. Down the street, he spotted Eli's small figure darting between shadows and pools of light cast by newly restored street lamps. Eli's laughter, light and unburdened, echoed faintly, a reminder of innocence amid the chaos. Mark watched him for a moment, a bittersweet smile touching his lips. This boy was his anchor, the reason he kept fighting, but peace remained fragile. Back inside, Mark's thoughts were disrupted by a sharp knock at the door. Carla stood there, her face tight with tension, eyes darting nervously. "We need to talk," she said, voice low but urgent. Inside the cramped living room, the air thickened with unspoken accusations. Carla's trust had frayed over the past weeks, her suspicion of the Resistance's methods growing alongside her fear. "Mark, you have to understand," she began. "There are things happening we don't control. People are acting strange again. It's like the blackout never really ended." Mark met her gaze steadily. "I'm aware, that's why I've been digging. There's a back door still open in the system. Someone's watching us." Carla's eyes widened. "Then what do? We can't fight shadows." Before Mark could answer, the door burst open and Jonas stumbled in, breathless and wide-eyed. "You need to see this," he gasped, holding out a tablet displaying real-time system alerts. "There's a new breach. Someone's trying to override the controls. If they succeed, Edenview could go dark again, but worse this time." The room fell silent, the weight of the revelation pressing down on them. Mark felt the familiar surge of determination, tempered by the knowledge that their fight was far from over. As the hours dragged on, plans were made and alliances tested. The aftershocks of the blackout rippled through Edenview, unearthing fears and fractures that threatened to undo everything they'd sacrificed for. Mark knew the road ahead was uncertain and perilous, but with Eli's laughter still ringing in his ears, he was ready to face whatever shadows lay ahead. Outside, the night deepened, the neon glow of distant city lights blurring into the horizon. Edenview was no longer just a community. It was a battleground for control, freedom, and the fragile hope of a new beginning. And Mark was at its heart, fighting not just for survival, but for the soul of the place he called home. The question hung heavy in the air: could they hold on to their freedom, or were the aftershocks of control destined to pull them back into darkness? The early morning air was crisp, carrying a fragile sense of calm that seemed almost foreign to Edenview's fractured streets. I stood just beyond the circle of tense faces, clutching Eli's small hand, feeling the unfamiliar warmth of hope flicker inside me. For weeks, the community had been a powder keg of suspicion and hostility, fractured by the collapse of order and the invisible script that had bound us in silence. But today, it was my son who held the key to something different: chance to heal. Eli, with his bright eyes and untainted spirit, had been watching the way neighbors eyed each other warily, how conversations turned to accusations, and how the shadows of Edenview's broken systems stretched long and dark over all of us. I had tried to protect him from the worst of it, but even a child could sense the tension that churned under the surface. This morning, as the sun began to spill pale light over the gated walls, Eli slipped from my side with quiet determination. He had gathered a small handful of wildflowers from the neglected patches of grass near the cracked sidewalk's simple, colorful blooms that seemed almost absurd amidst the decay. His small hands trembled slightly as he approached a group of neighbors locked in a heated exchange. "Here," Eli said softly, offering the flowers to a woman whose eyes were hard with fear and anger. "I picked these for you." The woman blinked, caught off guard by the child's innocence. The wildflowers were a stark contrast to the grim reality we'd all been living. She hesitated, then accepted them with a hesitant smile. The tension in the group shifted imperceptibly, a crack forming in the wall of mistrust. I stepped closer, heart pounding, as Eli moved from person to person, offering his small gifts. Each gesture was met with a flicker of surprise, a softening of expressions that had long been set in stone. It was as if his simple act of kindness reminded us all of who we were beneath the scars left by control and collapse. Jenna, one of the few neighbors who had dared to resist the scripted behaviors, caught my eye and nodded. Her eyes shone with renewed determination, a signal that maybe, just maybe, this fragile hope could grow. Suddenly, voices rose against two factions on the brink of confrontation, their anger bubbling dangerously close to violence. Eli, undeterred, stepped into the gap. His voice, clear and unfiltered by fear or suspicion, rang out. "Stop. We're neighbors. We're not enemies. We have to help each other." The crowd fell silent, stunned by the child's bravery. His words cut through the chaos like a beacon, reminding us of a truth we had almost forgotten. Slowly, the neighbors began to lower their fists, their gazes dropping from hostile to uncertain. Gavin, the community elder who had been skeptical of any hope, wiped his brow and took a step forward. "Perhaps it's time we listen," he murmured, his voice cracking with age and emotion. Encouraged, Eli took a deep breath and began leading a simple game, one we'd played in better days, encouraging laughter to ripple through the group. It was tentative at first, fragile like the dawn light, but it grew stronger. I looked down at my son, seeing not just the boy I'd been trying to protect, but a symbol of resilience and innocence in a world that had nearly lost both. In that moment, surrounded by neighbors beginning to reconnect, I dared to believe that even in Edenview's darkest hours, there was a light that could never be extinguished. But as the laughter echoed softly, I knew this was only the beginning. The road ahead was still fraught with danger and uncertainty, and the forces that had brought us here were not finished watching. Yet, for the first time in a long time, I felt something I hadn't dared to before: hope. And it was Eli's voice that had started it all. The night was far from over, but maybe, just maybe, the darkness was finally starting to lift. The hum of electricity surged back through Edenview's veins, like a slow, awakening pulse. It began subtly at first, a faint buzzing beneath the skin of the community, then blossomed into a chorus of clicks and whirs as lights flickered hesitantly to life. Mark stood on the porch of his home, the familiar yet now fragile glow of the street lamps casting long, tentative shadows across the cracked pavement. The darkness that had cloaked the neighborhood for weeks was finally retreating, replaced by the pale, flickering illumination of power restored. Ethan's small hand tightened around his father's, a silent anchor amid the swirl of emotions. The boy's eyes, wide and shining, reflected the streetlights like twin stars, a beacon of innocence in a world that had shifted beneath their feet. Mark could feel the weight of the moment, the relief, the exhaustion, the uncertainty, all mingling like the electric charge in the air. Neighbors began to emerge from their homes, blinking against the sudden brightness. Faces haggard and lined with the toll of sleepless nights and unspoken fears, turned towards the light with a mixture of disbelief and cautious hope. Murmurs rippled through the crowd, a symphony of voices hesitantly reclaiming their place in the world. Mark recognized Leela's silhouette moving steadily through the gathering, her sharp eyes scanning the scene with a quiet determination. "It's really coming back," she said when she reached him, her voice low but steady. "The systems, the lights, everything. But it's not just the power we have to think about. It's what's left in the wake." Mark nodded, his gaze drifting to the darkened windows of some houses still shuttered in silence. The blackout had been more than a loss of electricity. It had been a fracture in the very fabric of Edenview's carefully controlled existence. Now, as the glow returned, so too did the memories of the strange, scripted behaviors, the whispered secrets, and the unseen eyes that had watched them all. Inside the community center, Mr. Cartwright stood by the window, his silver hair catching the light as he spoke with Lila. Their conversation was hushed but urgent, weaving through the challenges ahead, the repairs needed, the mistrust to heal, and the vigilance required to prevent another descent into chaos. Outside, a gentle rain began to fall, pattering softly against the pavement and washing away the dust and grime left by weeks of darkness. Mark watched the droplets trace patterns on the street, each one a tiny promise of renewal. The neighborhood was waking up, but the scars ran deep. As night deepened, Mark took Ethan's hand once more and led him to the gates. The heavy barriers that had held them captive now stood open, a threshold between the shadowed past and the uncertain future. Beyond lay the distant city lights, a glittering horizon of possibility and risk. "Do you want to see what's out there?" Mark asked, his voice a whisper against the night. Ethan nodded, stepping forward with the hesitant courage of a child stepping into a new world. Together, they crossed the threshold, leaving behind the dark cocoon of Edenview's blackout. The night air was cool and alive with the sounds of distant life. Cars humming on highways, dogs barking faintly, the murmur of human voices far away. For Mark, the return of power was more than a technical restoration. It was the rekindling of hope, the fragile first step toward reclaiming their lives. Yet beneath the surface, a quiet question lingered. How would they rebuild trust, community, and freedom after the shadows of control and surveillance had taken so much from them? The road ahead was uncertain, but for the first time in a long while, it was illuminated by the glow of possibility. As father and son walked into the night, the future of Edenview awaited a blank page, ready for the stories they would write together. But the light also revealed what had been hidden: fractures in relationships, unspoken fears, and the ever-watchful eyes that might yet linger in the corners of their world. The battle for Edenview's soul was far from over. Yet, for now, in this moment of fragile dawn, Mark allowed himself a breath of hope. "We're going to be okay," he whispered to Ethan, who looked up at him with a trust that was both a balm and a burden. And as the first true light of freedom touched their faces, they stepped forward into the light, into the unknown, into what would become their new reality. The gates closed softly behind them, but the story of Edenview was just beginning to unfold anew. The air in the underground chamber was thick with dust and the faint hum of emergency power. Mark's fingers trembled as he sifted through the brittle papers, each page revealing a fragment of a story darker and more complex than he had imagined. The yellowed documents were stamped with seals of agencies he had never heard of, bearing cryptic codes and disclaimers that seemed deliberately designed to obfuscate rather than inform. Jason sat quietly nearby, his small frame huddled under a threadbare blanket, eyes flickering between his father and the scattered documents. The silence between them was heavy but comforting, a fragile cocoon amid the storm of revelations that threatened to unravel everything Mark thought he knew. Alina paced nervously, occasionally glancing over Mark's shoulder, her expression a mixture of guilt and resolve. "This isn't just about Edenview," she whispered, voice barely audible over the faint static of the emergency lights. "It's part of a larger project, a social experiment designed to test control mechanisms on populations." Mark's mind raced, piecing together the puzzle. The blackout, the scripted behaviors, the surveillance, all orchestrated. But by whom? The documents hinted at a coalition between corporate interests and government agencies, a shadow network pulling strings from far beyond the gated community's walls. As he played the encrypted audio file, the crackling voice of the archivist emerged calm, clinical, almost dispassionate. Edenview represents a prototype in behavioral modulation and social compliance. The data collected will inform policies and technologies with applications at a national scale. Resistance is anticipated and accounted for. Mark's jaw clenched. The coldness of the message, the lack of empathy, sent a chill down his spine. This was no accident. It was a calculated move in a much larger game. Jason's soft hand on his shoulder broke through his spiraling thoughts. The boy's innocence was a stark contrast to the insidious forces they faced. Mark looked down at him, a surge of protectiveness and hope igniting within his chest. "We'll get through this," he promised quietly. Outside the reinforced window, the gates of Edenview remained shut tight, the darkened streets eerily silent. But now Mark understood that escaping the neighborhood was only part of the battle. The true fight was against an unseen puppeteer whose reach extended far beyond these walls. Determined, Mark gathered the documents, tucking the most critical files into his jacket. "We need to expose this," he said to Alina. "Not just for Edenview, but for everyone out there." She nodded, eyes steely with newfound resolve. "Then we better move fast. They won't let us unravel this without a fight." The weight of the legacy they had uncovered settled heavily on Mark's shoulders, but it also sharpened his focus. The collapse of Edenview's order was not the end, was only the beginning. And as the faint glow of dawn threatened the horizon, Mark steeled himself for the challenges ahead, knowing the shadows they faced were darker and more pervasive than ever imagined. But even in the depths of this revelation, a flicker of hope endured the unbreakable bond between a father and his son, a light that no darkness could extinguish. And so, beneath the looming threat of control and surveillance, Mark prepared to fight not just for freedom, but for the future itself. The clock on the kitchen wall blinked erratically before fading into silence, just as the last flicker of light died in the living room. I sat frozen in my chair, the soft glow of the tablet screen vanishing like a candle snuffed out. Ethan's small hand gripped mine tightly, his wide eyes searching my face for answers I didn't have. "Daddy," I swallowed hard, trying to keep my voice steady. "It's okay, Ethan, probably just the power." But deep down, I knew this wasn't just any outage. Edenview was built on smart technology, integrated security, energy management, and communication systems that rarely, if ever, failed. This blackout felt different. It felt deliberate. I stood and moved towards the window, pulling back the curtain. The street was dark, the usual comforting glow of porch lights and street lamps extinguished. Neighbors were emerging from their houses, their movements synchronized in a way that sent chills down my spine. Mrs. Langford stepped onto her porch, her movements mechanical, her gaze fixed ahead without recognition. "Ethan, stay close," I whispered, guiding him away from the window. I fumbled for my phone, desperate for a signal or any sign of life beyond the darkened walls. The screen was dead, no bars, no messages, just a blank void. I tried again, rebooting, hoping for a miracle. A low murmur began to rise from the street, neighbors speaking in clipped, rehearsed tones that didn't quite fit the moment. It was as if they were following a script, their words and gestures devoid of genuine emotion. I stepped outside, the cool night air brushing against my skin, carrying a strange scent ozone mixed with something metallic. The community I'd trusted for years was now a stage for something I couldn't yet understand. "Mark," a voice called softly. It was Mrs. Jennings from down the street, her eyes glassy as she repeated the same phrase over and over. "Everything is fine. Everything is fine." I clenched my fists, fighting a rising tide of fear. What had happened to Edenview? And, more importantly, who was pulling the strings in this sudden descent into darkness? I looked down at Ethan, his small face illuminated by the faint starlight, and made a silent vow. Whatever this was, I would protect him, no matter what. The night swallowed us whole, and Edenview's lights went out. Blackout begins. But for us, the real darkness was just starting. Outside, the community was eerily silent, except for the soft, syncopated footsteps of residents moving in unison. Their eyes glazed over, lips whispering indistinct phrases. The usual hum of machines, the chatter of neighbors, the barking of dogs, all had ceased. The power outage was total. I moved cautiously down the street. Every shadow seemed to watch me. The gates that normally swung open with a simple scan now stood motionless, locked tight. I pounded on the nearest security panel, getting no response. My breath formed small clouds in the chilly air as I realized our isolation was complete. A deep unease settled in my chest. This wasn't a simple technical failure, but something far more sinister. The community that promised safety through technology had become a cage, and we were trapped inside. I glanced at Ethan, who clung to my side, his small fingers cold in mine. His innocent question echoed in my mind. "Daddy, why is everyone acting so weird?" I had no answer. Not yet. And then, from the shadows, a faint flicker of movement caught my eye. Mrs. Langford stepping off her porch again, repeating her motion like a marionette on invisible strings. The script had begun. The blackout was more than an absence of light. It was the beginning of something darker, a loss of control that threatened to consume us all. I took a deep breath, steeling myself for what lay ahead. This night in Edenview would change everything.